Trollope's Legacy, a personal view. I first suggested this theme because, as an avid reader, I'm always encountering novels and novelists which remind me of Trollope and his work. Sometimes this is a clear legacy in that the writer was a pronounced Trollopian. Interestingly, the legacy libraries of authors on the Library Thing website gives us some clues. C.S. Lewis, Evelyn Waugh, Barbara Pym, George Orwell, and Ernest Hemingway all had numerous Trollope novels in their libraries when they died. Sometimes ideas and interconnections just spark off in my head. I've crystallised these into a number of themes. I'd just like to talk briefly about my thoughts. Trollope's Barchester and Palliser novels were amongst the first series novels. Nowadays, there are academic debates about different definitions: series novels, novel sequences, roman fleuve, which I won't go into here. Suffice it to say that I'm thinking of novels which share common themes, characters or settings, but where each novel has its own title and a freestanding storyline, and can thus be read independently or out of sequence, if you like. There are many examples in 20th century and modern literature. Anthony Powell's Dance to the Music of Time, which I've yet to read, C.S. Lewis's Narnia books, Philip Pullman's His Dark Materials and related books, and Simon Raven's Arms for Oblivion series. Now little read, the 10 novels cover the period from 1945 to 1973 and centre on a group of upper and upper middle class characters, forming a novel sequence, if a somewhat loosely structured one. The early novels are satires of the English upper crust of the mid-1950s, but the later tend to be more detached and philosophical, becoming concerned with the occult and supernatural, and including strange happenings. You may know that he wrote the screenplay for The Pallisers and an early version of The Way We Live Now. For me, the main legacy in my mind is the Strangers and Brothers series of novels by C.P. Snow, published between 1940 and 1970. They deal with, among other things, questions of political and personal integrity and the mechanics of exercising power. The novelist Anthony Burgess described the series in these terms: a very considerable achievement. It brings into the novel themes and locales never seen before, except perhaps in Trollope. Snow analyses the professional world, scrutinising microscopic shifts of power within the enclosed settings of a Cambridge college, a Whitehall ministry, a law firm. For example, in a novel set in the Cambridge College, which is a thinly veiled Christ's, a small group of men is required to reach a collective decision of an important subject. In the Masters, the dozen or so college members elect a new head, the master, by a majority vote. Who will be the new bishop? I asked myself when reading this. In the affair, a small group of dons sets out to correct a possible injustice. They must convince the rest of the college to reopen an investigation into a scientific fraud. There are analogies here with Reverend Crawley and the stolen cheque. C.P. Snow created the term the corridors of power, actually a term that could easily have come from Trollope in The Prime Minister. Some of you may have read Snow's biography, Come Criticism of Trollope. I think this is a really insightful book, daring to put some of the perceived wisdom of Trollope and his era into context, especially in terms of the political context. Novels about societal and political change, set during a snapshot in time and featuring a sprawling cast of characters from all levels of society. This is the definition of a State of the Nation novel. Added to this should be a focus on money, making it, losing it, wishing for it. W.H. Auden said, of all novelists in any country, Trollope best understands the role of money. Compared with him, even Balzac is a romantic. Some of you may remember the AGM lecture from 2013, when novelist Alec Preston talked about his encounter with The Way We Live Now and how it influenced his own novel, This Bleeding City. I'll read out a short section from his lecture, which you can also read in full in Trollopiana 97. I came to Trollope earlier than intended, having imagined him as an author I'd reach once contemporary novels scared me with their vigour. But 3 years ago, my grandfather suggested I read The Way We Live Now. I was instantly transfixed. During the financial crisis of 28, I was a banker working near Augustus Melmotte's offices in Abchurch Lane. I thought I'd read everything worth reading about the financial world until I read The Way We Live Now. It should have been merely historical, but instead it spoke with exquisite clarity of our contemporary world of dodgy mortgages and stock market crashes, exhibiting a villain so uncomfortably close to Bernie Madoff. Trollope is an author of supreme relevance whose distinctly moral voice is needed more than ever. Authors of State of the Nation novels, such as myself, my novel, This Bleeding City, was the first attempt to tackle the credit crunch in fiction, have been influenced by him and his capture of the obscure workings of the world of finance. Even the title, The Way We Live Now, was radical. We forget that most of the major Victorian novels were historical. We think of George Eliot as the author of mid-Victorian England, but Middlemarch, written in 1871, was set in the early 1830s. Vanity Fair, Great Expectations, Wuthering Heights, Bleak House were all historical. The now in Trollope's title is the engine driving the novel, making it more daring and enduring than anything else he wrote. The credit crunch of 2008 to 10 spawned a number of novels of this ilk. John Lanchester's Capital, Mark Lawson's The Deaths, Sebastian Folkes's A Week in December. All of these are worth reading, and I dare say the COVID-19 era will spurn other examples of this genre in time. Many pre-Victorian English novels were set in familiar or not so familiar domestic worlds. Yet some of the characters wielded power. Some were clergy, but the setting of the action of the novel was largely in the home, whether it was a privileged one, a humble one, or somewhere in between. With Trollope, we entered into 3 distinct worlds: the church, which was undergoing a period of major change and so ripe as a setting for drama and humour; politics, again lots of major changes; and the civil service, which was just starting to become the professional organisation needed to run a sizable empire and manage railways, telegraph services, and the post office. By using these settings in his novels, Trollope allows us to enter new and unfamiliar worlds, but worlds where the characters have the same emotions and motivations as us. Trollope, C.P. Snow, used similar worlds in his novels, although the church appeared somewhat tangentially. Another of my favourite authors, Barbara Pym, is an author who used a similar approach. Like Snow, she was a keen Trollopian, and her novels are peppered with references to Trollope's works and characters, mainly related to the church. She left 7 Trollope novels in her legacy library. In fact, these novels were sold by Blackwell's after her death. Pym used another interesting world of many of her novels, the learned world of anthropology. She was part of the academic penumbra herself, as her main day job was deputy editor of a learned journal called Africa, still published today. Through this, she got to know many eccentric anthropologists. As an author, she was something of a literary anthropologist herself, constantly observing her characters with more or less detachment. Of her 10 novels, 4 feature the world of academic anthropology as a central setting. It's remarkable for a writer viewed as an expert in domestic social comedy. Pym, like Trollope, has a cast of characters, sometimes minor, that can be used by the author across novels and plot lines to add context and continuity and engage the avid reader. Trollope does this exceptionally well. Actually, the 25-year-old Plantagenet Palliser appears first in a Barsetshire novel, The Small House at Allington. Amanda Craig, another overlooked contemporary novelist and a great Trollopian, very cleverly uses recurring characters across her novels in much the same way as Trollope. She's written a series of 8 interconnected novels which deal with contemporary British society, often in a dramatic and satirical way. Writing in The Independent in 2009, she said, "I adore Trollope and reread him regularly. I owe to him, more than any author, my moral education, my understanding of how British society still works, and my determination to write novels that are, as far as I can make them, also about the way we too live now. I've set out to take the DNA of a Victorian novel, its spirit of realism, its strong plot, its cast of characters who are not passively shaped by circumstances, but who rise to challenges or escape them. In Craig's novel series, characters move lightly between novels in a playfully Trollopian manner. For example, a school nurse in her new scathing novel about a liberal boarding school, A Private Place, becomes the mother of the principal character in her latest novel, The Golden Rule, which I'm currently listening to on Audible. By the way, it's brilliant. I also thought of Jilly Cooper. Yes, also a Trollopian, I gather. One of her characters wanders through fields in Laura Ashley dresses, reading the Prime Minister. Her Redshire Chronicles are set in a late 20th century Barsetshire with a cast of interconnecting characters who also weave in and out of the novels, and which are set in such worlds as show jumping, classical music, and TV. P.G. Wodehouse, living in Paris in June 1945, wrote to a friend of his discovery of Is He Popenjoy, the first Trollope novel he'd read. "I found it almost intolerably slow at first," he said. "Then it suddenly gripped me, and now I'm devouring it. It is like listening to somebody who is a little long-winded, telling you a story about real people. The characters live in a most extraordinary way, and you feel that the whole thing is true." Sometimes when I tell people I like Trollope, they think I mean Joanna, our society's vice president. Actually, I like Joanna's books too, for one of the main reasons I like her distant ancestor Antony's work, the psychological insight into characters, especially women. She herself has said, "Oddly, my name has been no professional help at all. It seems to have made no difference. I admire him hugely, both for his benevolence and his enormous psychological perception." I've dipped into Joanna's novels, essentially snapping them up when I see them at church book sales. They're to be savoured. Like Pym, they are better and more observant than expected from a so-called romantic novelist. Joanna is clearly doing something right. Writing at a rate of probably one novel every 2 years, she's sold more than 1 million books in the last decade. They cover a number of contemporary issues, including broken families, lesbianism, adoption, loneliness, and looking after elderly parents. They can be quite bleak in tone, but throughout the novels you feel as though you understand the characters and what makes them who they are, in much the same way as you do with Antony's. I really like The Rector's Wife. The Amazon blurb states, "For 20 years, Anna Bovary, as a priest's wife, has served God and the parish in a variety of ways. She has baked for the brownies, delivered parish magazines, washed and ironed her husband's surpluses, and clothed herself and her children in jumble sale items. When her husband fails to gain promotion to archdeacon," this reminds me of something, "and retreats into isolated bitterness, and the bullying of her daughter at the local comprehensive reaches an intolerable level, Anna rebels. She takes a job in a local supermarket where she earns her own money, her sense of self-worth, and the shocked disapproval of the parish, and the icy fury of her husband. She also attracts the passionate interest of 3 very different men, each of whom was to play a significant part in the blossoming of her life." Sounds somewhat familiar, doesn't it? For me, another Trollope legacy theme is the world of work. Trollope was one of the first novelists to describe working life. And as a civil servant, I can identify with some of the storylines in the novels even today. The Three Clerks was clearly influenced by real experiences, and indeed it is considered to be a primary source for historians, as so few other accounts of the civil service of the time exist. The character of the chief clerk at Weights and Measures, Sir Gregory Hardlines, who is so enthusiastic about the system of civil service examinations, was based on Sir Charles Trevelyan, and the excellent Sir Warwick West End, full of the best intentions, was, as Trollope said, a feebly facetious name for Trevelyan's associate and fellow reformer, Sir Stafford Northcote. These two men wrote a seminal report that actually shapes the civil service to this day. As a keen reader of contemporary literature, I'm disappointed by how working life is portrayed in the novels I read. Actually, Barbara Pym actually describes the pettiness of office life, probably because, like Trollope, she combined writing with a proper job. When I read The Fixed Period with the Cambridge Seminar Group recently, I was struck by an article by David Lodge, the academic and writer. I thought back to his campus novels, especially Nice Work, which features a feminist academic and a factory manager who shadow each other as part of an industry scheme. Looking at work through the comparative eyes of the two main characters, their motivations and characters, struck me as quite Trollopian. And actually, for me, this is part of Trollope's legacy that's still undeveloped. I'm waiting for more contemporary novels about work. Finally, Trollope is well known for his working practices, which allowed him to combine writing with working at the post office, fox hunting, and a lot of general socialising in his clubs. He describes this in his autobiography. I attribute the power of doing this altogether to the virtue of early hours. It was my practice to be at my table every morning at 5:30 a.m, and it was also my practice to allow myself no mercy. It had at this time become my custom, and still is my custom, though of late I have become a little lenient to myself, to write with my watch before me and to require from myself 250 words every quarter of an hour. I have found that the 250 words have been forthcoming as regularly as my watch went, but my 3 hours were not devoted entirely to writing. I always began my task by reading the work of the day before, an operation which would take me half an hour, and which considered chiefly in weighing with my ear the sound of the words and phrases. I would strongly recommend this practice to all those in writing, by reading what he has last written, just before he recommences his task. The writer will catch the tone and the spirit of what he is then saying, and will avoid the fault of seeming to be unlike himself. This division of time allowed me to produce over 10 pages of an ordinary novel volume a day, and if kept up through 10 months, would have given as its results 3 novels of 3 volumes each in the year. I have long been fascinated by the process of writing, though I don't really write myself. Since Trollope, authors have shared their secrets of successful writing. I've enjoyed some of these books. Folks on Fiction by Sebastian Folkes is a good read, as is Stephen King's On Writing. Yes, I admit to enjoying his works, particularly his early ones. Some of the tips could have been penned by Trollope himself, and I will leave you with this thought. 14 tips from Stephen King on writing. 1. If you want to be a writer, you must do 2 things above all others: read a lot and write a lot. 2. Stories consist of 3 parts: narration, description, and dialogue. 3. The situation comes first. The characters, always flat and unfeatured to begin with, come next. 4. Whether it's a vignette of a single page or an epic trilogy, the work is always accomplished 1 word at a time. Or in Trollope's case, 250 words every quarter of an hour. 5. The most interesting situations can usually be expressed as a what-if question. 6. The best stories always end up being rather about the people rather than the event. 7. With a passive verb, something is being done to the subject of the sentence. The subject is just letting it happen. You should avoid the passive voice. 8. Talk, whether ugly or beautiful, is an index of character. 9. Description begins in the writer's imagination, but should finish in the reader's. 10. The road to hell is paved with adverbs. 11. Never use emolument when you mean tip. 12. Set a daily writing goal. As with physical exercise, it would be best to set this goal low at first. I suggest 1,000 words a day. Obviously, you had a computer to write with, which Trollope didn't. 13, call that one person you write for ideal reader. He or she is going to be in your writing room all the time. And finally, if you can do it for joy, you can do it forever. I think that's a really good final point. So thank you very much for listening.